in the 21st century through means strongly grounded on metta, in other words, loving kindness. The first Metta Convention was held in Singapore in June 2013 on the theme of Meeting of Hearts, and upon the request by Reverend Mahinda Thero, Sarvodaya Shramadana Movement of Sri Lanka is organizing the second Metta Convention on the theme Healing of Hearts in Sri Lanka from the 27th to the 29th June 2014. The inauguration ceremony will take place on the 27th June 2014, that is this Friday, at the BMICH main hall from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. and the main convention will be in Bandaragama. If anyone wishes to register for the Metta Convention, there are a limited number of seats still available for the locals. So please speak to the registration desk outside for more information. Going along with the spirit of Metta Convention, I would now like to most respectfully invite Reverend Mahinda, the Spiritual Director of Aloka Foundation Malaysia, to start off today's proceedings with a few minutes of Metta meditation.
Just bring your attention within. You may choose to close or half close your eyes. And bring your attention close to your heart. Observe the calm, the quietness within. Remain in this state of calm and quietness for a few moments with clear awareness that whatever phenomena that arises, the sounds that you hear, feeling, sensation that arises, you have clear awareness of that. Your mind is not disturbed, not distracted. In this state of calm and quietness, you will commence with the practice of metta, of loving kindness, wishing yourselves to be well and happy. As you wish yourselves well and happy, feel a sense of well-being. And keep a smile in your heart. Be free from anger, free from enmity, from hatred and grudges, free from sufferings, from fear, worries, anxieties, and just dwell in calm and peace. Just as you wish to be well and happy, calm and peaceful, you will now spread out loving kindness all around you. Feel the calm, the quietness within radiating above, below, and all around you. Fill this whole room with your aura of calm and peace. And the good wish in your hearts that all who are present be well and happy. Going beyond the confines of this room to the whole building, the whole premises of Water's Edge. moving out to the whole city of Jayawardhanapura. Reaching out to the whole country, the whole island. And beyond this country to all neighboring countries, all the neighboring islands, covering the whole world. And all the realms of existence, known or unknown to us, seen or unseen, that may all beings be well and happy. All beings be well and happy. May all beings be well and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you.
Our sincere gratitude to Reverend Mahinda for that very relaxing session of guiding us along the path of peace and metta, at least for a few moments. Today's session, which is being held as a fundraiser for the Metta Convention, will be moderated by Dr. Vivi Marie van der Putten, who is an award-winning Sri Lankan poet and a scholar. Her book, Nothing Prepares You, won the 2007 Gratian Prize, and she was also awarded the 2009 SARC Poetry Award in Delhi. She holds a PhD from the University of Ulster, UK, and is currently a senior lecturer in English language, literature, and linguistics at the Open University of Sri Lanka. Her poetry has been called gentle, reflective minimalism, which touches the soul, by the panel of judges who awarded her the Gratian Prize. She won the State Literary Award for English Poetry in October 2011, and her work has been translated into Sinhalese, Spanish, and Swedish, and are published overseas as well. I warmly welcome Dr. Vivi, whom I believe is the most fitting person this evening to introduce our world-renowned poet and speaker, David Whyte.
Good evening, and thank you for that very generous introduction. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you today's main speaker, David Whyte, who makes his home in the Northwest Pacific and who grew up in Yorkshire and has called Wales and Ireland his home. His Irish mother had a strong imaginative influence on him, and he started writing poetry at age 7. Today, he is an internationally recognized name in the field of organizational leadership. He is also a poet and prose writer, a trained naturalist and thinker with a degree in marine zoology. David Whyte expertly straddles 3 worlds, which may at first glance seem mutually exclusive: the literary world, the psychological and theological world of philosophical inquiry, and the world of work and organizational leadership. He is the author of 7 volumes of poetry and is an associate fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford. I'll read to you one of his very small poems that caught my fancy, and I think it's very relevant. This is not the age of information. This is not the age of information. Forget the news and the radio and the blurred screen. This is the time of loaves and fishes. People are hungry, and one good word is bread for 1,000. So without further ado, let me invite David to unravel the beauty of this extraordinary fusion he has found between poetry and business. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here in your country, and I want to thank the Savodia movement and Dr. Ari and Banti and all the wonderful hospitality that I've had here, including the new cuisine I've discovered, Sri Lankan food, absolutely marvelous, and I just feel like I'm in a country that's on a threshold and the cusp of a new dispensation, and something about that's happening all over the world, which is a new sense of the future, but it's taking a particular tonality and coloration here, and it's no accident that people are coming from all over the world to be part of the Metta Convention, for which this is a preparatory talk. And loving kindness, I don't think, is too far away from what is needed in the postmodern world of leadership. And we can think of loving kindness as lovey-dovey kindness, but you can also think of it as a deep state of intentionality, that when you really understand who you're with, you have a natural form of affection for who you're with. Yeah. And when you understand the true nature of your vocation and your work, then you have a love for that work. And when you have an understanding of the way that you as an individual hold the conversation of life in your work, you start to learn self-compassion. And it's quite astonishing that one of the opportunities of our time is that the very qualities that human beings have wanted for themselves since the beginning of time are the very qualities that we now need in the postmodern workplace. And those are qualities of adaptability, vitality, creativity, and participation. And the interesting thing is that as a boss or a leader, you cannot coerce any of those qualities. You cannot ask an individual for an increase in their creativity quotient this week, please, of 5.7%, rising into the 50th percentiles. Yeah? These qualities belong to a part of a human being which is uncoercible. Yeah? It can't be forced. And the extraordinary thing is these qualities are also as much a mystery to the individual as they are to the person who's trying to elicit these qualities from them. And so I'm really interested, as I've worked in organizations all over the world for 25 years or more now, and I'm really interested in how you can practically ask for these qualities. And to my mind, you ask for them through making an invitation. And you make an invitation through creating real conversations. And what I want to do is to look at what I call the phenomenology of conversation this evening. And you ask yourself, what is the phenomenology of conversation? Well, it's just a fancy philosophical way of saying what happens along the way when you try to have a real one. And especially in a leadership position where you are visible to others, one of the primary dynamics of leadership is visibility. And the interesting thing is, as a leader, you can refuse to say a word to anyone in your organization. You can refuse to give anyone a clue. And we have all worked with leaders like this. They're there and they're not there at the same time. You know? But the interesting thing is, even if you refuse to say a word, everyone around you and everyone who depends on you will still be looking at you to see what story you are telling. They will look at your body language when you come into the office and the way you carry your briefcase, how you get out of your car in the morning, and the expression on your face. Because we are, as individuals, storytelling sentient beings. Yeah? And human beings are constantly trying to belong to the biggest story they can. Yeah? So it's interesting to think that as a leader, I have a form of visibility which is representative of the basic theological dynamic of incarnation. I'm here in life. Why am I here? What story am I telling? What story do others think that I am telling? So it's no wonder that people actually get quite frightened of actually embodying true leadership position. Because you actually have to live up and be seen by other people. And in a leadership position, there is actually nowhere to hide. And even though we try to be superhuman beings when we are leaders, everyone can see our flaws. And everyone already knows them. And everyone actually knows some of the flaws that we have not yet admitted to ourselves. So one of the great invitations and the frightening invitations of leadership is to honesty and self-knowledge. And it's also to courage, to hold courageous conversations in public and learn skillful means as to how to do that. To risk ourselves as individuals for the collective. So I wanted to begin, and I want to look at these different stages in the courageous conversation, in the leadership conversation, through poetry. I'm a poet first and foremost, and I just happen to have been invited into the workplace 25 years ago, and I have not yet escaped from it. So, and this is a piece actually about someone dedicating themselves to their vocation for the rest of their life, and it's William Wordsworth in 1798, declaring that to himself and to the world that he's going to go full-time as a poet. Yeah. And I can assure you that when you do declare that you're going full-time as a poet, people do not rush up to you, slapping you on the back, saying, "Great career move, David." And I hear they're taking them on at Lockheed right now in droves, and there's a great pension plan that comes with the poetry. No. People get very, very silent. Yeah? And you'll meet a lot of silences in your life. But the silence of the father-in-law is beyond all silences you'll ever meet. There's a certain Buddhistic depth to the silence of the father-in-law who wants to know if there's any shred of evidence that you can keep yourself, never mind his daughter, in any manner to which you want to become accustomed. Yeah? So the act of someone dedicating themselves to a path such as poetry has always been a magnified representation of the courageous steps every human being has to take in their vocation and their work, where the mysterious ground which you're walking is not fully recognizable to you, and you actually cannot fully explain it to anyone else. And yet you must still take that step. So this is William Wordsworth, 1798, and he's gone back to his mountain home, this beautiful corner of England called the English Lake District. It's called the Lake District, but it's as much a mountain area as it's a lake area, and there are beautiful, craggy, rocky mountains, lakes, woods, falling streams and footpaths that connect everything together, and stone villages everywhere. And it's still much as it was in Wordsworth's time in 250 years ago. And Wordsworth has lived away from this place for quite a while when he writes this piece. And he comes back, and he's astonished at the beauty of the place which grew him. Yeah. And it's interesting that we talk about individual genius, and we talk about the individual genius of very famous people. But it's interesting in where the word comes from in English, because in the ancient Latin world, the word genius meant the spirit of a place. And it meant that every place has its own particular quality which you will never find anywhere else. And Sri Lanka has a genius to it which you will never find in another part of the world. It's such a miraculous island. And you can go to a lot of other islands in the tropics around the world, but it would not be Sri Lanka. And in the Latin world, it would be said to be the genius loci, the spirit of the place. So it's interesting to think a merciful way of looking at human creativity is to see each human being as a place, a meeting of your ancestry, your mother, your father, and their parents before them, the meeting of the meteorological conditions, of the warmth of the island here, the monsoon, the lushness, the greenery, the availability of all the fruits. These come together to make a conversation called Sri Lanka, which cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world. But equally, each one of us in this room is also a meeting place of stories and qualities and people who went before us, which is not replicated in any other human being. Each one of us is a conversational frontier which has never ever existed since the beginning of time, and never ever will exist until the end of time. And this is why in all great religions, each individual life is seen as being sacred, because of the unique genius that is represented by the frontier conversation that each of us hold. So Wordsworth went back to this astonishing genius loci, the English Lake District, and he had the experience that many of us have when we go home, when we've been away for a long time. You suddenly realize what a remarkable place it was indeed that you grew up in, and so much of it you took for granted. And he went to a Midsummer Night's Dance. It was midsummer, just as it was June 21st, yeah. And he danced all night. And he was so happy to be home, and he was so happy to be back with his people. But at the same time, he was under tremendous pressure from all of his guardians to get a decent job, which did not include poetry, yes. And they wanted him to take a job in the Church of England as a priest, yeah, which was someone else's genius, but not his, yeah. And he's under tremendous pressure. But then he finishes dancing at 4 o'clock in the morning, and in those latitudes, the sun is actually coming up, and he starts walking home in the dawn. And this is the experience he has as he's walking through the dawn, through the mountains, in this place, which he's never seen as beautiful in his whole life. And there are just 3 words I need to explain, because it's a 200-year-old poem. And you have to explain these even to people in England, because some of the words have dropped out. The first word is used a lot in England, but the word pomp, as in pomp and circumstance, a royal procession. When he talks about the pomp of the situation, it means a royal procession of the clouds and the sky. The second phrase is the phrase grain tinctured. Tinctured by grain, dyed by a red grain. So if you're wearing a red sari, you are wearing a grain tinctured sari. Yes. And then the last word is empyrean, which means heavenly. Yeah. There, you've had your preparation now. You'll understand the poem completely. Yeah. But so this is Wordsworth, 1798, Midsummer's Night. He says, 2 miles I had to walk along the fields before I reached my home. 2 miles I had to walk along the fields before I reached my home. Magnificent the morning was, a memorable pomp, more glorious than I ever had beheld, more glorious than I ever had beheld. The sea was laughing at a distance. All the solid mountains were as bright as clouds, grain tinctured, drenched in Empyrean light, while in the meadows and the lower grounds lay all the sweetness of a common dawn, with dews, vapors, and the melody of birds, and laborers going forth into the fields. Laborers going forth into the fields. Ah, dear friends, need I say, but to the brim my heart was full. Ah, dear friends, need I say, but to the brim my heart was full. I made no vows, but vows were then made for me. Bond unknown to me was given, that I should be, else sinning greatly, a dedicated spirit, and on I walked in blessedness, which even yet remains. 2 miles I had to walk along the fields before I reached my home. Magnificent the morning was, a memorable pomp, more glorious than I ever had beheld. The sea was laughing at a distance. All the solid mountains were as bright as clouds, grain tinctured, drenched in Empyrean light, while in the meadows and the lower grounds lay all the sweetness of a common dawn, with dews, vapors, and the melody of birds, and laborers going forth into the fields. Ah, dear friends, need I say, but to the brim my heart was full. I made no vows, but vows were then made for me. Bond unknown to me was given, that I should be, else sinning greatly, a dedicated spirit, and on I walked in blessedness, which even yet remains. I always remember being on an island in the Philippines, working with a group of Filipino executives, and we were having a great old time, and we were there for 5 days on this amazing island. And it was from Ayala Company, a very big Filipino company, and but someone had the idea, as they do on these executive programs, that we should get up before dawn, go to the top of the mountain on the island, and the poet, myself, should recite a poem about the dawn. And I was at very, very great pains to explain that if poets did see the dawn, it was usually because they'd stayed up all night beforehand, But they rarely ever got up for it, particularly poets of Irish descent, to see it, But this argument was of no avail whatsoever, and I found myself walking up beside this crowd of executives in the dark, thinking which poem, and of course I said Wordsworth. And I recited this poem at the top of the mountain, and it was an absolutely perfect description of this mountain and this sea. The sea was laughing in the distance. All the solid mountains were as bright as clouds, grain tinctured, drenched in Empyrean light, and even the people walking into the rice fields to work, into the paddy fields, and laborers going into the fields, and everyone wanted to know who this Filipino poet was that they'd never heard of before. Yes, it was just an absolutely perfect description, because it is an absolutely perfect description of what happens in every human heart when you hold the conversation at such a depth that you realize you're not the individual being you thought you were. You're actually in a conversation with creation, and that the world is actually coming to find you. And this is a deep religious understanding. It's there in the Buddhist tradition. The great Japanese Zen master Dogen Zenji said, if you go out and confirm the 10,000 things, if you name everything, say, that's X, that's Y, that's where X and Y cross, that's this, that's that, you're good at that, you're not good at the other thing, I'm this, you're that, this is delusion. This is delusion. If the 10,000 things come and confirm you, this is enlightenment. If the world if you allow the world to speak to you in its own voice. And this has a very practical scientific basis, because when I was 13 years old, I saw Jacques Cousteau, the very famous French zoologist, sailing across my little black and white television set. And, I couldn't believe that you could get work in the world where you could live on a boat and follow the life of the dolphin. And so I gave up all my art subjects and put myself into the salt mines of biology, chemistry, and physics. Yeah? And I emerged many years later with a degree in marine zoology. But then I found that everyone else had been watching Jacques Cousteau, and they were all graduating at the same time. Yeah? And there weren't enough Calypso boats to carry us. There weren't even enough dolphins for us. You know? It was 0.5 dolphin per graduate when I came out. Yeah. And there wasn't a, but through sheer luck and a lot of visible and invisible help, I got this astonishing job in the Galapagos Islands. And I went off as a newly minted scientist into the world. Yeah. And the name I'd given myself to scientist was someone who knows everything. That was my private secret name for what a scientist should be. But when I got to those islands, I found that none of the birds or the animals had read any of the zoology books that I had read. Yeah? And they insisted on having lives of their own. And I found it actually quite terrifying. First of all, it was quite terrifying being in the islands because we were living on sailing boats and we did all the sailing by night. And at that time, there was no GPS. It was all done by dead reckoning. And all of the sailing was done by night in these very treacherous waters. And I couldn't figure out for the first 6 months how the local Ecuadorian crew were actually doing this. So I felt very close to death the whole time. And I felt very close to death also because you would witness animals that you got to know individually passing away day by day. Yeah? And then it was very terrifying to my identity as a scientist. Yeah? If I'm not a person who has the answers, who am I? Especially as a naturalist guide, my job was to preserve the islands, but to do it through education. And I thought education meant knowing everything, yeah? Having all the answers. And it was only when I gave that up that I began my real apprenticeship as a scientist, yeah? Which is to let the world come and find you and speak to you in its own name. Yeah? So this is also one of the erroneous parallels we have in leadership, that my job as a leader is to have all the answers. Yeah? I had this remarkable moment many years ago. It was during the dot-com boom, and I was working with a big chip maker on the outskirts of Boston. There's a highway that goes around Boston, and all of these electronic companies and computer companies are all strewn along this highway. And I was working with this chip maker, and I'd been working with a division of it, and the man had been very, very successful, who was the head of this division. But he was an engineer. Yeah. And he'd never given a thought in his life, really, to leadership. He was just doing the best technical job he could. But he was recognized, and then he was promoted to be the CEO of the whole company. And the only person he told was myself. The only person he told was that the thing he told me was that he was terrified, you know. And he really didn't know how to occupy this position. So there was a big day coming up where they were to have a visioning day for the future. And would I come, give the talk in the morning, and then there'd be a big tour around this new factory. And it was also, by the way, bring your son and daughter into work day at the same time. So they would come too. Yeah. So this is a big thing in the United States, bring your son or daughter into work, which is, I don't know if it's come to Sri Lanka yet. It's a good thing, I think, for a child to see what's taken you away from them all of their life. Yes. It's gone too far now in the States because it's now bring your budgie into work, you know, bring your parakeet into work and all, and dog and all the rest. Yeah. So, but it's a very good thing. So I gave the talk, and then we go on this tour, and I noticed that the CEO, the new boss's son is with him. And I could tell that the boss was really proud of his new position, and especially in the light of his son being there. So he was showing him, he had the biggest office in the place, of course, yeah. And here was this new $40 million building and factory, and he was the head man, and he was walking around. But I could tell that the son wasn't impressed at all. And one of the dynamics you get when you bring your son or daughter into the postmodern workplace quite often is they cannot believe how catatonically boring the adult workplace is. Yeah? And they're saying to themselves, this is why you've been worrying about my education. This is why you're so fussy about everything I do and everything I say, and so you can hand me this. Yeah, it doesn't look very impressive, but he's hiding this truth from his father. He's protecting the father from the fact that he thinks it's incredibly tedious, but I can tell he's not impressed at all. So we go around the whole day, and the boy's pretending to be impressed as the father's proudly showing him everything. And then we end up in a circle at the end, and I'm with the top leadership team, and we're all standing there with a glass of wine and a little plate of hors d'oeuvres, you know, and the son is with us too, of the CEO. And suddenly the CEO calls across the circle and says, "Son, what do you think of what I do?" And the son looks both ways and he says, "It's all right, Dad, what you do." And he tries to move on, but the father won't have anything. He said, "No, son, come on. What do you think of what I do?" He really wants, and the whole circle goes quiet. And the son looks around in panic because he knows he's going to tell the truth. Yeah? "What do you think of what I do, son?" And the son says, "Well, Dad, I didn't actually see you do anything." And I thought the father was going to take the son down in a tackle. Yeah? And he said, "How do you mean you didn't see me do anything? I've been killing myself all day." He said, "Dad, I didn't see you do anything. All I saw you do all day was talk. You talked with David, you talked with the vice presidents, you talked on the phone, you talked on your PDA, you talked on the computer. I didn't see you do anything, you just talked." And I could see the scales falling away from the CEO's eyes because the son had nailed him. This is exactly what he'd been doing. But because it was his own flesh and blood, this wasn't just an abstract conversation. This was his own son on the cusp of his own adulthood, you know, 13, 14 years old. He took a linguistic step that he might not have taken if someone had asked him that question in the abstract. Yeah? "I didn't see you do anything." And the CEO said, "Listen, son, there's a conversation happening out in that world and it's changing every day, and I've got to find out what that conversation is. And I have to be talking to people all over the world. And it's no use me coming in late into that conversation because by then someone else has actually taken what we want as our place in the world. And so I've got to catch it really early, so I have to be talking to people all over the world, Singapore, India, Sri Lanka, who knows where. Do they want larger chips, more simpler chips, or has the whole world changed? They're never going to want another chip that we manufacture again. I've got to know where that story is," he said. So actually, son, he said, and this was a real surprise to the CEO when he said it, "I'm chief conversationalist around here. I'm chief storyteller, and I've got to know what the story is." And I remember saying to myself, I don't need to say another word. The son has been the consultant today. Yeah? And it's really quite remarkable how each of us are storytellers. And it's a beautiful question to ask yourself, what story am I telling just by walking around? What identity am I shaping? And especially, quite fiercely, what invitation am I making to others? Because you could say that a leader is also not only a chief conversationalist, but a chief invitationalist. Yeah. But whether you're a leader or not, it's a very beautiful question to ask yourself. How invitational is my identity? And I think a real invitation is a very loving and very kind thing to do, as well as a very practical thing to do. One of the astonishing things about work, one of the beautiful things about work, is being needed. I have a friend who was a travel agent, and now, of course, there's hardly a travel agent left in the world because of the internet, especially in North America. So she had to retire. She retired early, and she was looking forward to it. She had the excuse not to work, and she was financially able to do that. But about a year later, I met her in the street and I said, "How is retirement?" And she said, "You know, it was wonderful for the first 6 months until you wake up one morning and you realize that no one anywhere in the world needs you for anything. And it's quite devastating. And that's when you get up and you make yourself needed again, and you want to contribute. So one of the primary privileges of work is just the act of being needed. That someone, astonishingly, would want to pay you to turn up, yes. Or, in the instance of a wonderful non-profit organization, such as Savodia, you get paid in a different kind of coin, which is through the satisfaction of your volunteering and giving. But this sense of actually contributing, of being part of a larger story than your own, this is also part of the invitation that the leader has to make. What's the nature of the invitation that I am actually making to the people to whom I have some responsibility? And can I lead them in a courageous direction? And would they want to follow me? Is my invitation actually authentic? Or is it just surface jargon? Is there anything real about the invitation I want to make to my people? So I just want to take you on a little journey through these steps that lead to this place where Wordsworth got to, this moment of revelation where your life is actually dedicated to something that you're completely clear about. This is an earned achievement. This takes it has the necessity of following the Pilgrim Path to a place and shaping your identity into a more conversational and frontier form. And I always say that the first step in having a courageous conversation, whether it's you as an individual or in an organization, is simply to stop having the conversation you're having now. The courageous conversation always involves giving up a conversation that's taking up your energies or the energies of your team or the people who are dedicated to the direction in which you want to go. So it's a very beautiful question to ask, what is the conversation we need to stop having that's holding us in the prison of the past? So this is a piece that I wrote for my Irish niece, Marlene McCormick. And there's a beautiful pilgrimage path in Europe, and it's called the Camino de Santiago, the path to Santiago de Compostela. It's 1,000 years old, and it used to be just a Christian Catholic pilgrimage. And now it's an ecumenical pilgrimage. There are people from all over the world, of all religions and no religion at all. We even have Australians walking the path there. And we haven't quite worked out their cosmological take on the world. But and no, there are people from every kind of inheritance. And people who are walking it, trying to find out why they've been convinced to walk it in the first place. And it's really quite marvelous because it brings so many cultures together. And my niece, Marlene, she graduated with a degree in Irish drama from the University of Sligo in Ireland, and deciding that the organizations of the world would not be knocking on her door to employ her, she thought she'd take a little spell and she'd walk the Camino de Santiago. And then she came to my house to stay afterwards. She flew from the end of the Camino to the States. And she got off the plane in a very Irish way. I said, when is your return ticket? And she said, I don't have one. And I said, well, you're welcome to stay as long as you want. And she did, for a year and a day. But really marvelous young woman, very talented. And I was just in the middle of writing this Pilgrim book, and my latest book of poetry, and it had a whole cycle of poems about the essence of pilgrimage. The fact, I mean, you can have a pilgrimage if you're going to Varanasi, or you're going to Kyoto, or you're going to Jerusalem, but you can also have a pilgrimage in your mind when you set a goal for yourself. That's really important. you've decided that that place is really important. And you're going to go from this place to that place. Yeah. But the dedicated and serious pilgrim knows that in going from this place to that place, you are actually going to reshape your identity. You are actually going to be a different person who arrives in Santiago de Compostela, in Kyoto, in Lhasa, than the person who first set off. Yeah. And so you can think of a pilgrimage as an actual real journey. But then there's also the pilgrim identity that doesn't need to move an inch. Just by having your feet on the ground of your life, to be fully and utterly here in your body, in your breath, in your culture, with your people, with your family, in this time, but with your eyes on a horizon to which you want to go. You are holding the conversation between the ground of your life and the horizon which is beckoning you forth. And you are the pilgrimage itself, and you do not have to move a single inch from the place you're standing. So you have the pilgrimage. Human beings are like, just as in physics, we're both a waveform and a particle, like light. We hold both those things together. So I was driving Marlene to a concert. My daughter was to be singing in this classical concert, and it was through a very cold, rainy winter's night in Seattle. And there's a reason why there are so many coffee shops in Seattle, and it's because of the winters. And there's a reason why people read so much in Seattle, and it's because of the winters. Yeah? And we were driving through this cold night towards the concert. My daughter was already there. And I said, Marlene, I haven't asked you one question about the Camino. This is a beautiful word, by the way. I mean, it's like the word way in English. It means not only the way that you take, but the way that you are when you're taking the way. Yes. So, Camino. And actually in Spanish, there's beautiful lines of poetry from Antonio Machado, and almost every Spaniard knows these lines. He said, Antonio Machado said, Caminante no hay camino, si así camino al andar, si así al camino. Pathmaker, there is no path. You make the path by walking. By walking, you make the path. Caminante no hay camino, si así camino al andar, si así al camino. Yeah. In mathematics, this would be called an iterative equation, yes, where everything's fed back in to make a different outcome according to the way you go through each step of the equation. So I said, Marlene, tell me, what was the most profound moment you had on the whole journey? And it took her 7 weeks to do it. She said, well, actually, the most profound moment was almost post-Camino. Because when you get to the city of Santiago de Compostela, there are 100,000 people living their own very busy lives. And they're not necessarily lining the streets to welcome you in as you come, applauding you walking into the city. But there are 10,000 of them who are trying to sell you something as a memento of your walk. Yeah. So like most goals, there's every temptation to forget why you set off on the journey in the first place. This is a very ancient difficulty for human beings. As they approach the harvest, to remember the essence of what drew them to that place in the first instance. Yeah. But she said you do have the possibility to go on another 3 days to the coast, to the Atlantic. Yeah. And it's a place in Spanish called Finisterre, which comes from the Latin Finisterre, which means the ends of the earth. Yeah. And the people in Europe 2,000 years ago did indeed think it was the ends of the earth. They had no idea there was an America over there, or a Sri Lanka over here, or they thought if you went over that horizon, you didn't come back. Yeah. Or if you did come back, you didn't find anything. So it was the edge of your world. And so when you go there, you go through 3 rituals. And first of all, you eat a dish of scallops, because the scallop shell was the badge of the pilgrim, which you wore sewn into your clothes. So you consumed the essence of your journey in a way. And I'm sure there's a vegetarian alternative, especially in these days for those of that persuasion, yeah. I said, what was the second ritual? She said, you burn something that you brought. I said, what did you burn, Marlene? She said, I burned 2 postcards and a letter. And I said, well, that's quite astonishing for a 23-year-old today to have actual paper and not just to take out your iPhone and delete 2 or 3 traumatic texts, you know, from your... She said, no, I had 2 postcards and a letter and I burned them. And I said, what was the third ritual? She said, you leave an item of your clothing. And there are big piles of clothes there. Hats and raincoats and jackets and socks and gloves. And I said, what did you leave, Marlene? She said, I left my shoes, my boots. And they were new when I started, and I loved those boots. But they were finished. They were falling apart. And I left them there on this pile. She said it was really quite extraordinary because the sun was going down, but behind me the full moon was coming up. And when the sun dropped down behind the horizon, the full moon was still reflecting the sunken sun. And I actually had a moon shadow which was walking across the water. But I knew intuitively that when the source of illumination disappeared, so would my shadow. And it was just as if that moon shadow represented my old self, which was going to disappear. And I would now have to walk across that water by some way, myself. Yeah. I'd have to find a different way to walk into the future. And she said, up to that moment, I didn't believe that I could actually write drama myself. And she said, at that moment, I realized I had to walk into my future and I had to write a play. Just as I had studied plays, I had to try it myself, at least try it. Yeah. So we got into the concert, and I wrote when the lights went out, and the lights came up, and the lights went out again. The music was playing. I wrote again. We went home. Everyone went to bed. I sat on the couch, and I wrote until 2 o'clock in the morning. And then at breakfast in the morning, I gave this poem to Marlene, and it's called Finisterre, The Ends of the Earth, for Marlene McCormick. The road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken. The road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken into the western sea. The road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken into the western sea. And the moon rising behind you as you stood where ground turned to ocean. No way to your future now, no way to your future now, except the way your shadow could take, walking before you across water, going where shadows go. No way to make sense of a world that wouldn't let you pass, except to call an end to the way you had come. The road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken into the western sea, and the moon rising behind you as you stood where ground turned to ocean. No way to your future now, no way to your future now, except the way your shadow could take, walking before you across water, going where shadows go. No way to make sense of a world that wouldn't let you pass, except to call an end to the way you had come. To take out each frayed letter you had brought and light their illumined corners, and to read them as they drifted on the late western light. To empty your bags, to sort this and to leave that. To promise what you needed to promise all along, to promise what you needed to promise all along. And to abandon the shoes that brought you here right at the water's edge. To abandon the shoes that brought you here right at the water's edge, not because you had given up, but because now you would find a different way to tread, and because through it all, part of you would still walk on, no matter how, over the waves. Not because you had given up. Not because you had given up, but because now you would find a different way to tread. And because through it all, part of you would still walk on, no matter how, over the waves. To empty your bags, to sort this, and to leave that. To promise what you needed to promise all along, and to abandon the shoes that brought you here right at the water's edge. Not because you had given up, but because now you would find a different way to tread, and because through it all, part of you would still walk on, no matter how, over the waves. So it's quite extraordinary, really, the Finistairs that all of us have to walk through in our life. Difficult Finistairs. The Finisterre from childhood to adolescence. The Finisterre that lies at the edge between adolescence and starting to realize that we have to take on responsibility in the world. The Finisterre of becoming married or a new parent. And then all the Finisterre of reaching the late stage of midlife, when you can no longer convince yourself you're in the early stage of midlife. And more seriously in midlife, the moment that you realize that you're going to die. Because when you're 21, you know someone's going to die, but it's someone you're going to become. You're not going to die. When you're 51, you are going to die. And it's very personal. And there's also a sneaking suspicion that the rest of creation might be just a little relieved to see you go. So you can stop repeating yourself, taking up all this oxygen, and something a little more creative can come in and take your place. So this very, very grounded understanding when you realize, oh, I'm actually not here forever. I'm part of the great impermanence of things also. I'm part of the seasonality of life, and there'll be a time where I won't be needed anymore. And I'll go to that great Finisterre at the end of life, where I'll have to prepare myself for the great unknown and the great invitation beyond it. So, of course, when we're in the corporate work world, we're not exempt from this seasonality and these thresholds and these moments at the edge. Each time you're given more responsibility, you're actually given an invitation into greater visibility in the world, and also greater responsibility. Not just for your own fortunes and your own success, but for those you're invited into greater and greater responsibility for other people's lives at the same time. And you can turn your face away from it and pretend that you're still 25 years old. But the consequences of it are enormous, both in your own life and in other people's lives too. And I've worked in huge companies, for long term, where I've seen enormous consequences from people who've refused to have that conversation. I was working at a very large aerospace company near Seattle, which will remain nameless. And there was a man there who I knew personally, and he brought the whole company to its knees. This is in the late 90s. Because he would not face a central conversation inside himself about his own mortality. And he wanted to have one more 25-year-old run at the enemy lines on the back of a white horse. And so he decided that he was going to, and he used this phrase, we're going to kill Airbus, he said, in a big meeting. And we're going to do it by doubling our production of airplanes. So this phrase is a very violent phrase, of course, and it creates distrust. Not only it creates distrust because if I'm listening to a leader saying that, I'm saying, oh, you want to kill Airbus now, things only have to shift a little bit and you'll want to kill me. So I'm actually going to be very, very careful about the conversations that I get into around you. So I'm going to pretend that I'm in the conversation, but actually part of me is going to stay well away from you. So this is a bad thing to say as a leadership. Not only that, but from a practical point of view, the people, the company, the people, the competitor that you identify as your enemy always turns you blind to what's actually happening in the world that you need to actually adapt to on the broader front. Yeah. So I had a good old year there working at that company and witnessed these massive events that were based on an individual's lack of self-knowledge. So the greater the visibility, the more of an invitation through the doorway of self-knowledge. And through the doorway of self-knowledge, in understanding how you're going to make the invitation to others. At the end, so speaking of finding a different way to tread, at the end of the year that I worked with all of these executives, there was a new aeroplane called the 777, which was launched. And it won all these awards. And I got this phone call. I was at my writing desk. They said, would you please write a poem for the 777 aeroplane? And I said, well, poets don't usually do very well under these circumstances. I said, I'm not going to write a propaganda piece for you. So if I can't write anything that's not just advertising, then you'll have to have an empty space. And they wanted, the aeroplane had won a big aerospace trophy, and they wanted to put this poem at the dinner on everyone's table. So I put the phone down and I said, well, if I can't get anything decent, they won't have anything. But I thought, I've spent half my life on aeroplanes. Yeah? What's going on when you're up there? One of the interesting dynamics is that you can be in the most astonishing cloudscapes, passing over the Maldives or anything, and people are just looking at People magazine in the aeroplane. You know, there's many people who don't want to believe that they're at 30,000 feet, traveling at 550 miles per hour in a very narrow aluminium tube. It's not happening. Therefore, I will read my magazine, and I'm not looking out of that window. Why? Well, because you can't actually see the forces that are holding you in place. Yeah. But I remembered, you know, sometimes when you're dropping down through layers of temperature and humidity, you will sometimes see a very solid white line which appears over the wing. Yeah. And when you see the invisible made visible, you realize that the forces that are holding you in place are as solid as concrete. But they're made up of a conversation between velocity and the beautiful shape of the wing. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, that relationship has been there since the beginning of time. But we only entered that conversation about 100 years ago, where we put the two things together. So it's a really beautiful question, is to say, what are the elements inside me that have not yet joined that will allow me to travel metaphorically thousands of miles? Yeah? What are the elements in my organization which have not yet been put together in a way which will allow us to go beyond horizons we could never have imagined of going? So I wrote this piece, and it's called Working Together, which is the slogan they used for producing the 777. So working together. We shape ourselves to fit this world. We shape ourselves to fit this world. And by the world are shaped again. The visible and the invisible working together in common cause to produce the miraculous. We shape ourselves to fit this world. We shape ourselves to fit this world. And by the world are shaped again. The visible and the invisible working together in common cause to produce the miraculous. I'm thinking of the way the invisible air traveled at speed round a shaped wing easily holds our weight. I'm thinking of the way the invisible air traveled at speed round a shaped wing easily holds our weight. So may we in this life trust to those elements we have yet to see or imagine. so may we in this life trust to those elements we have yet to see or imagine, and find the true shape of our own self by forming it well to the great intangibles about us. We shape ourselves to fit this world, and by the world are shaped again, the visible and the invisible, working together in common cause to produce the miraculous. I'm thinking of the way the invisible air, traveled at speed round a shaped wing, easily holds our weight, easily holds our weight. So may we in this life trust to those elements we have yet to see or imagine, and find the true shape of our own self by forming it well to the great intangibles about us. I often think that one of the central necessities of the pilgrim, someone who is on their way from here to there, but also one of the central necessities of leadership is the ability to ask for both visible and invisible help. I'm only one person. I only have one pair of eyes, one pair of ears, one pair of hands, one intellect and one imagination. I need to invite as many imaginations and intellects and hands and ears and eyes to help me see this incredibly complex world as I can. How good am I inviting those other eyes and ears to help me? And you can be the head of a multinational company, or you can just have a little group of people you're working with as a co-worker, but you can still take a leadership position where you ask for this help. And to my mind, there are two kinds of help. There's visible help, which is mostly transactional help. I say, I will pay you this amount and you will turn up every day and look as if you're doing something. Yes. And but then, or you will pay for a night at the inn on the Pilgrim Way. But then there's the other kind of help, which may be the most important help of all, is the ability to ask for invisible help. And we can think of invisible help in two ways. The ancient religious contemplative understanding that there are other parallels than our own. There are other worlds that exist now that we haven't touched. Just as there was a world of flight which has been with us since the beginning of time. And it was with us from the beginning. But we just never put those two things together that allowed us to actually undertake it. And then you can think of other angelic parallels, depending on your belief system. But in a very practical, everyday sense, invisible help is the help that you do not as yet know you need. You don't know what help you're going to need in order to go into this new dispensation, into this new world, into this new industry, into this new field. If you tell yourself that you do, you're not being realistic. You can't, because that world is literally just being formed. So a proper identity is a humble identity. It's one that has a good relationship to the unknown. So that when we take the first courageous step in the conversation, which is to stop the conversation we're having now, we don't immediately replace it with another manufactured conversation. We start to actually make a real relationship to what cannot be as yet spoken. In other words, a relationship with the unknown. So as if you're in a creative position, a position of responsibility, it's really a beautiful question to ask yourself, what is my relationship to the unknown? First beautiful question, what is the conversation I have to stop now? Or I have to ask us all to stop. Second beautiful question, what is my relationship to the unknown? Do I have any relationship to the unknown, or am I deeply uncomfortable with it and I need to tell a story no matter what's happening, even if it's not the true story? how much am I able to pay attention when things are still forming in the background and have not yet announced their true name to me? And then, to my mind, the third step is coming to ground, touching something in that unknown where we actually realize we're walking into new territory, making contact. And there's a beautiful essence of this at the beginning of a great poem called the Commedia by Dante Alighieri in Italy. And he starts the whole piece. He had a trauma and a Finisterre in his own life, and he wrote to try and understand what had happened, why life had been so hard on him. He'd been a member of the ruling class in the downtown Republic of Florence in 13th century Italy. And then he was thrown out of power along with his family and told he couldn't come back home again to the city of Florence. So it's just as if every foundation had been taken away from him. And there are three possibilities we're faced with when we have this trauma in life. When things no longer are behaving in the way they did. When you've reached a new stage in your marriage and the same conversation just doesn't seem to work anymore. When you've reached a new stage with your children and the old conversation doesn't make any sense to the child or to yourself. When you've reached a new stage with your company or your organization or with your non-profit organization. When you've reached a new stage in your own heart and mind. And there are three temptations. The first temptation is to pretend that it didn't happen because it was so traumatic. You can't actually believe that this is true. One of the disbeliefs we have as a parent is that our child is no longer a child. So you keep treating him as a child way beyond the time. One of the most difficult conversations to keep alive is the conversation between a parent and an adolescent boy or girl. Father or mother and a boy or girl. Why? Because we're almost always, as a parent, trying to relate to someone who is actually no longer there. And the conversation usually, if you've got busy lives like we all have here, usually takes place in the kitchen as you're passing by like this. And you just get the Doppler effect, like this, And it usually takes place, it usually starts with the parent saying something deeply unhelpful to the child as you're going past, And you just say it automatically, it's just instinct, Say something unhelpful. But they've lived with you for many years and they know how, under the guise of respect, to say something equally unhelpful back to you, And then you catch it only as you've gone away and you come back and you say something even more unhelpful to them, And then they're retreating away from you up the stairs. And the last moment is where you're standing on the stairs and you've got your hand raised as a father or a mother and you're saying the last deeply satisfyingly unhelpful thing, just as the door slams in their bedroom, So I found myself in this position a year or two ago with my daughter, Charlotte, And I was stood on the stairs with my hand raised and my mouth open, about to say that deeply satisfyingly unhelpful thing, which you've earned the right through your blood and sacrifice over the years to say. And I caught myself and I said, David, this is not a real conversation. Take your own advice, I said. How do you make this a real conversation? First of all, stop having the one you're having now. So I pulled my hand down, closed my mouth, turned myself around, went into the kitchen, and I did what every Irish person does in the middle of trauma. I put the kettle on for a cup of tea, and probably Ceylon tea, I'm sure it was. I put the tea on, the therapeutic Ceylon tea, and then I started just instinctively to get a nice tea set out. I got her grandmother's tea set out, and I set out a really nice tray. And then I got out my daughter's favorite biscuits, and I gave it 10-minute cool down time, went up the stairs, knocked on the door, and in a different, more invitational voice, I said, Charlotte, come on, let's have a chat, So I put the tray down, and I didn't know what I was going to say to her. But I just happened to say exactly the right thing. Otherwise, I would be telling you a different story now than the one. But I found myself saying, Charlotte, I said, tell me one thing you want me to stop saying or doing as a father. And she looked up for a moment. And I said, and tell me one thing you want me to do more of. And when I said that, she was looking at me and she was shocked, you know, because this actually was a real conversation. Why was it a real conversation? I was actually asking her who she was now. Yeah? It wasn't me placing a name on her that imprisoned her. It wasn't me wanting her to be 3 years younger, 2 years younger. My little girl. Yeah? It was me saying, tell me who you are now. I'm willing to hear it. Yeah? And from then on, we were into a proper conversation. Yeah? So who's here now in my life? Yeah? Who am I married to? It's a different frontier, a different conversation than the man or the woman I said yes to so many years ago. Yeah? Who am I as a father now or a mother? I'm in a different seasonality than I was even just a few years ago. Yeah? And in my positions of responsibility and leadership, who am I becoming? I'm not that person who set off looking for a certain kind of success so many years ago. I've actually matured and changed as I've come along. Yeah? And I need to harvest the actuality of both who I have become and what the world has become around me. And I need to make that conversation real. Yeah? What is the conversation I need to stop now? What is my relationship to the unknown? How courageous am I in allowing myself to actually meet something in that unknown that I don't recognize to begin with? Yeah. And then I think every conversation proceeds along what I call is an axis of vulnerability. Yeah. There's no conversation without vulnerability. We're all used to these assessments now in the postmodern corporate world. But I don't know if you've ever tried to have an annual peer review with your wife or your husband. It doesn't work very well. Say, excuse me, darling, would you look in this white folder over here? I just want you to see that in this quadrant of our relationship, you're actually doing quite well. You're in the upper 50th percentiles, and whatever you're doing, please keep doing it, you know. But please look in the green folder over here, and you'll see in this quadrant of the relationship, you're down in the low 30s. And I'd like to see you put an action plan in place over the next 3 months, whereby you bring it up 25 percentile points into the mid 50s. Yeah? And may I now hand you the red 360 folder, and you'll see that other people have noticed it too. How long would this conversation last? No time at all. Before you're out the door. Yes. Why? Because there's no vulnerability. There's no invitation. It's just an act of sovereignty, from my perspective, over another person. One very powerful question to ask yourself in an intimate relationship when you're trying is, where is the axis of vulnerability? Where do I need to be vulnerable? Usually you get there by admitting a few of your own flaws and difficulties, yeah? And the way you find it difficult to hold the conversation. And the other person finds that an invitation and admits a few of their flaws too, and you get there together. Usually you get there by admitting that you don't know actually how to hold this conversation. And as soon as you do that, you're in the conversation. But it's interesting to ask, what would the equivalent vulnerability be in the workplace? Because it's a different form of vulnerability than the one in a marriage or relationship or as a parent. To my mind, the foundational vulnerability in leadership is simply admitting that not only do you not have all the answers, but you're actually not meant to have all the answers. And that puts you in a proper and realistic relationship to reality. Why? Because you have to ask for help. You have to create a conversation. You have to get the right people in the room with the right talents. And some of those talents are going to outshine yours. Yeah. So it's a test of your character and your humility to be able to follow a conversation through to harvest. Yeah. And speaking of harvest, I'd like to bring this side of the conversation to an end with this last poem, and then open it up to a short, how are we for time? Are we, do we have time for question and answer? We do, yeah, good. So, this, you could take each one of these conversational stages, and we could spend a whole day just on stopping the conversation, just of the relationship with the unknown, just on following the axis of vulnerability. And then to my mind, every conversation culminates in an invitation. So another beautiful question to ask when you're stuck in a conversation is, where is the invitation in this meeting place? What invitation needs to be made in order to move us along? Do I need to make it? Do I need to ask for an invitation from the other person? Is the invitation from the outside world surrounding this room that we both have to acknowledge? So I'll finish with this piece called Santiago, supposedly arriving at the goal. And I wrote this as I felt the whole creative cycle around these Pilgrim poems coming to an end. I wrote a particular poem, and as soon as I wrote that poem, I knew that the tide had changed and there was a new voice coming in. And so I started writing really quickly to get as many Pilgrim poems as I could, you know, before the tide changed. So, and this is one of the last ones I wrote, and I started it at my friend's house in Oxford in England while I was teaching there. And then the next day I was on a 747 to Seattle. And I sat 5 hours in seat 64A, whatever it was, upstairs. And I know I sat 5 hours there because when I stood up, I fell over. My leg had fallen asleep, you know. And but the poem was done, and I had it on 2 pieces of paper. And I went and got myself a glass of wine. And I stood on the steps between the upper deck and the lower deck with reading the... And then a friend of mine who was also a fan of my work came up the steps. And he said, "What do you have there?" I said, "I have a new poem." I said, "Would you like a world premiere of the poem?" And he said, "I'd love to hear it." I said, "Well, get a glass of wine and we'll enjoy it together." And so I read it to him. So it was interesting to write it on that modern form of pilgrimage, the 747 aeroplane. And this is about the supposed endpoint. The road seen, then not seen. The road seen, then not seen. The road seen, then not seen. The hillside hiding, then revealing the way you should take. The road seen, then not seen. The hillside hiding, then revealing the way you should take. The road dropping away from you, as if leaving you to walk on thin air, then catching you, holding you up when you thought you would fall. The road seen, then not seen. The hillside hiding, then revealing the way you should take. The road dropping away from you as if leaving you to walk on thin air, then catching you, holding you up when you thought you would fall. And the way forward, always in the end, the way that you came. The way forward, always in the end, the way that you came. The way that you followed, the way that carried you into your future, that brought you to this place, no matter that it sometimes had to take your promise from you, no matter that it always had to break your heart along the way, no matter that it always had to break your heart along the way. The sense of having walked from far inside yourself out into the revelation, the sense of having walked from far inside yourself out into the revelation. To have risked yourself for something that seemed to stand both inside you and far beyond you, that called you back in the end to the only road you could follow, called you back in the end to the only road you could follow, walking as you did in your rags of love, walking as you did in your rags of love, and speaking in the voice that by night became a prayer for safe arrival. So that one day you realized that what you wanted had actually already happened. One day you realized that what you wanted had actually already happened, and long ago, and in the dwelling place in which you lived before you began, in the dwelling place in which you lived before you began. One day you realized that what you wanted had actually already happened, and long ago, and in the dwelling place in which you lived before you began, and that every step along the way you had carried the heart and the mind and the promise that first set you off and then drew you on, and that you were more marvelous. You were more marvelous in your simple wish to find a way. You were more marvelous in your simple wish to find a way than the gilded roofs of any destination you could reach. You were more marvelous in your simple wish to find a way than the gilded roofs of any destination you could reach. As if all along you'd imagined a city with golden domes and cheering crowds, and turning the corner at what you thought was the end of the road, you found just a simple reflection and a clear revelation beneath the face looking back, and beneath it another invitation, all in one glimpse, like a person or a place you had sought forever, like a bold field of freedom that beckoned you beyond, like another life, and the road still stretching on. The road seen, then not seen. The road seen, then not seen. The hillside hiding, then revealing the way you should take. The road dropping away from you, as if leaving you to walk on thin air, then catching you, holding you up when you thought you would fall. And the way forward, always in the end, the way that you came, the way that you followed, the way that carried you into your future, that brought you to this place, no matter that it sometimes took your promise from you, no matter that it always had to break your heart along the way. The sense of having walked from far inside yourself out into the revelation. To have risked yourself for something that seemed to stand both inside you and far beyond you, that called you back in the end to the only road you could follow, walking as you did in your rags of love, and speaking in the voice that by night became a prayer for safe arrival. So that one day you realized that what you wanted had actually already happened. One day you realized that what you wanted had actually already happened, and long ago, and in the dwelling place in which you lived before you began. And that, every step along the way, you had carried the heart and the mind and the promise. Every step along the way, you had carried the heart and the mind and the promise that first set you off and then drew you on, and that you were more marvelous in your simple wish to find a way than the gilded roofs of any destination you could reach. As if all along you had thought the end point might be a city with cheering crowds and golden domes, and turning the corner at what you thought was the end of the road, you found just a simple reflection and a clear revelation beneath the face looking back, and beneath it another invitation, all in one glimpse, like a person or a place you had sought forever, like a bold field of freedom that beckoned you beyond, like another life, and the road still stretching on. And I'll dedicate that poem to the work of Dr. Arya Aratna there in the front seat, yes, who has embodied many of the qualities in Santiago, going to his own Santiago. And thank you very much for accompanying me for a stretch along that pilgrim road. Tonight it's been the pilgrim road of leadership, visibility, responsibility for ourselves and others. But it's just a parallel to the great human journey. And as I say, we live in a really remarkable time where the very qualities that have been wanted by human beings themselves since the beginning of time are the ones that are needed in our organizations, and especially in our government organizations, because everything is being magnified today, and the stakes are increasingly higher and higher, both in the air we breathe, the water we drink, the land on which we live, and the climate which has sustained us for so many millennia. So, thank you very much. And I've been asked to inquire if you have any thoughts or questions or observations, unsubstantiated assertions with no evidence, whatever you want. Yes, you're welcome to. Any of the themes or images that spoke to you? Con, yes. I think we have a microphone for you there, Con, yeah.
David, I thought I was levitating for the last 1.5 hours. Some of the observation that you had made had reminded me to look at a conversation that I have to have in relation to my daughter, to my wife, and also in the what next after you have led a corporate life. Yes. Of working day and night without realization, what is my true destination? You have inspired me to look at my conversations again, and I want to thank you. And tonight has been a privilege for me to be here to listen to your conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So we'll take the silence as a compliment. Yes. So thank you for. I often say that what I've been working with but one person's doing all of the talking. but But actually there is a conversation which has been occurring in this room, and that's between your listening. And the silence in the room is the place where I feel the invitation to go. So we've all actually made this talk together tonight through your listening and the depth of your listening. And so and that's led me in certain directions which I would have I might not have taken if I was with another audience and another set of listening ears, and not in Sri Lanka and not in the genius of this place, or with the genius of your listening. So thank you very much for helping to shape the talk tonight. And I know we have some refreshments for everyone, and it'll be a pleasure to circulate and have more informal conversations. Yes. Oh, we do have another question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. You speak about the corporate setting. I feel that one of the places in which this conversation also needs to be held is in the medical setting. And in fact, the medical setting is an area where many people who work in that setting are deeply wounded, and in fact, in their education are taught not to have these deep, meaningful conversations, and in fact are taught to avoid having these deep, meaningful conversations. And one of the things that I do in my work is to try to teach physicians to have these meaningful conversations, but it would be a wonderful thing for you to bring your message into the medical world, because your message would be deeply meaningful.
I'm afraid I'm already there. I've been working in every corner of American health care for 25 years, actually, and British health care too, and Canadian. Wonderful. And what you say is very true, and it is partly because the work brings you into a direct conversation with mortality and death and disappearance. And so if you think you're just in a profession, and then that conversation is going to be quite traumatic for you. So doctoring and nursing is something that calls for immense kind of humanity and spaciousness, to not only have space for the person, but also for the great human conversation with mortality and disappearance. And if your identity is only about being successful by making a person better, you're going to have great difficulty with that conversation. So that's where the invitation lies, to the greater understanding of what healing means. And often at the end, healing simply can simply mean my story being heard, as you implied, that the listening ear is incredibly healing, whether it's on your deathbed or whether it's how you got into this place in your body or into this office with this health professional. So it's a very, very necessary path to take. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, thank you very much, and I wish you well. I look forward to having a chat with you more informally. Thank you. Yeah. And may I encourage you again just to look at the Metta convention which is occurring, see if there's any corner of it you'd like to attend. It is quite a remarkable privilege for Sri Lanka to host this convention, and coming out of the work of Bhante and many other dedicated people and many of the volunteers who are in this room, who are approaching the harvest of many, many months of work in this week. So, and there are remarkable people coming here, remarkable conversations. Would be a pity for you to miss at least just to touch in a little bit with them. So I invite you to do that. Thank you.